Magic the Gathering's a game. We're all trying to have fun. And believe it or not, Stax players are trying to have fun too.
Welcome, everyone, to the Playing with Power podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things CEDH, EDH, and Magic in general. I am your host, Ryan, and today we are going to be talking about Stax, how to play it, how to defeat it, and much more. We have brought on a great guest today, and his name is Joseph from Casually Competitive MTG. Hey, Joseph, how are we doing today?
Hey, Ryan, doing all right? Doing pretty good.
Great. So why don't you tell everyone who you are and what Casually Competitive MTG is, or just what you're up to in general.
Like you said, I'm Joseph from Casually Competitive MTG. We release YouTube videos and do live streams based on what we call semi-competitive EDH, which is pretty much just high-powered commander. We do run a lot of CEDH combos, but we take some liberties with some unique and maybe some unoptimal card choices just for the sake of flavor for the most part, but generally just high-powered Magic.
Awesome. Absolutely love them. Go check them out. But not yet, because we're going to be talking about Stax first. So, once again, very much thank you for being on the show. But before we go any further, really wanted to talk quickly about our sponsors. They are TCG Player, Dragon Shield, and your support from Patreon. So whenever you're buying product, make sure to buy it from tcgplayer.com. There's a link in the description. You get really, really great prices, and you get to support local game stores in the process. When you get those, make sure to put them into Dragon Shield accessories. They are some of the best industry standard around for when it comes to product. Absolutely 100% recommend them. Definitely check them out. Also a link in the description. And finally, support from viewers like you. When you support us on Patreon, you really help us bring this content to you. We try to give a whole lot back for all of your support, including things like Discord access, live streams, all kinds of different things. Some higher tiers even have things like being able to play with us on an episode. So definitely check that out. See if there's a tier that's right for you. And we really, really appreciate all of your support. One of the other things that we do as part of the support is do a shout out to a random patron on every one of these episodes. And tonight's random patron shout out is Jim McCullough. Jim, thank you very much for your support. Really, really appreciate it. All right, so without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. So we're talking about Stax, and that's somewhat of a taboo subject at some tables. So we're going to talk about maybe some stigmas around it, playing with it, playing against it, some myths, misconceptions, all of that kind of stuff. So Joseph, let's just dive right in. Let's talk about it. What is Stax?
Well, I may not have like an actual dictionary definition. Keep in mind, I'm relatively new to Magic the Gathering in general. I only started playing very briefly before we started the channel, so just a few years. But generally, when I describe Stax to people, it's really just a permanent-based preventative piece. So something that stops someone from playing something proactively, something that you play as a permanent ahead of time that will hinder a person from playing their own cards in the future.
So Stax gets its archetype or its name from Smokestack. It's a permanent. It's an artifact originally from the Saga block, and basically what it is that you can put a soot counter on it on your upkeep, and then all players during their upkeep sacrifice for every soot counter on it. This prevented people from advancing their resources, and where they kind of colloquially come up with the term stacks, because you would use Smokestack in order to generate that. And that kind of is the term that carries through to this resource denial, this permanent-based denial, or this resource control type archetype that we've seen in Magic through all these years. So we've talked about kind of the dictionary definition of Stax. Talk to me about what you would consider Stax to be, maybe from your own personal experience or how you've seen it played. Talk to me about it maybe from a personal perspective.
Sure. I might have maybe a little bit of a liberal definition of the word Stax. I kind of separate Stax into a few different categories. For example, I would consider something like Ristic Study, in a sense, a little bit of a Stax piece, more of a soft Stax piece, but it does, do a little bit of work to prevent people from playing spells, at least playing it the way they want to play it. So that's kind of what I would say is maybe more of a softer Stax piece, at least a little bit. And then we get into pieces that are a little bit harder, and a good example that I like to use for this is Thalia. Something that just adds a standard tax onto your spells. They can still play the game of Magic, but little bit more difficult to play it. So a little bit more intense than Ristic Study. You can't ignore it. You have to pay for it. So just a little bit more preventative. And then I have kind of this tier 3 of stacks, which is, the good old orbs, Winter Orb, Static Orb, things that actually prevent someone from playing the game or actively hamper their resources. Tangle Wire is a good example of this, something they can avoid and something that they can't really play around too well unless their deck is specifically geared or at least has the pieces to deal with it reliably.
Some people will give the stigma of Stax is bad, and I didn't kind of not play Magic, and Stax has a lot of stigma around it, and it's very interesting that you love it because a lot of people would say, "Oh, I don't like Stax." I personally love Stax, and that's just my personal opinion. So, why did you start playing Stax? There's the stigma around it. There's some people don't like resource denial. Tell me about that story or your journey in the world of Stax, if you will.
Well, you're gonna get a little casually competitive lore here. Like I said, I'm relatively new to Magic. The rest of the guys that are involved with casually competitive started playing well before I played, and I took a little while to get into it. And as I was starting to become interested in it, one of my friends from the group just sent me a link to EDH Rec. They have a list of different themes. And he's just like, pick a theme, we'll make you a deck around it. And at this point, the play group was fairly casual. We hadn't really gone into any type of higher powered commander at all. It was very laid back. We'd have 6 to 8 player casual commander games, like, just a kitchen table game of Magic. So I was scrolling through the list and, I saw Tribal, I saw some other, land-based decks, stuff like that. And then I saw Winter Orb. In the stack section, I was like, this seems awesome. I want to build a deck around this. And it was Jordan. Jordan just looks at me and he's like, no, you cannot do that. That is the one category that is not allowed. You can pick any other category, but that one's not allowed. So, we went on and I ended up making, I think, a Merfolk tribal deck. But that always kind of stuck in my mind. So as I got more into Magic the Gathering and EDH specifically, we started, kind of having that eventual power struggle that I think a lot of playgroups run into, where people want to start buying better cards, playing more powerful cards, and the power levels just kind of creep up a little bit. And at that point, I was playing a Storm-based cast list, and one card that really resonated with me as I started, and it was at this point that I really started to look into other people's deck lists and really getting inspiration from what other people had built, rather than just kind of Googling or looking up cards in the color pie that fit the commander. So I was playing Kess, and one card that I saw consistently in a lot of these lists was Cursed Totem. And I saw that card and I was like, this card is great. It stops, pretty much what everyone else at the table is doing and doesn't affect me at all. Why would I not play this card? And so I picked up Cursed Totem, played it, had a great time with it. It did exactly what I wanted it to do. And at that point, the earlier Stax conversation from before that I had when I was building my very first deck kind of just came back to me, and I started looking to it more and more, and it just seemed like a perfect fit for the play style that I wanted to go for, kind of a more methodical play style, and really being able to plan around in it. Not even just the play style, but also the deck building process as well. I really started to like it and to get into it, and that kind of led me into a blue pod style of deck, a very old, and this predates the evolution decks, I think, as far as I know. But getting into Blue Pod, and that was really the first deck where I really sat down and built a deck designed around some soft stacks pieces and some tax effects and some pieces that stopped people from playing the game. And it kind of has just snowballed from there into Blood Pod lists, complete lockout lists, and it just gets meaner and meaner, I guess.
I think meaner is, I don't know, maybe might be a good term for it, but I tend to, whenever I'm playing with stacks or against stacks, I definitely have that feeling that I'm no longer playing checkers and I'm playing chess. Because not only from a stacks perspective, getting into stacks, when you're playing with it, I have a stacks deck. It's not about just, okay, I've got this much card, I've got this much CMC, now I'll play this card. Now I'll play this card, and I just start to puke out my hand. You have to get really strategic when it comes to, a card. A classic example, you have Cursed Totem, right? You don't want to throw your Cursed Totem out, just to have it out. You want to see whether or not Cursed Totem is the resource you want to commit to. And you have to get a little bit more planning around that. And that really intrigues me. I love that concept. Is that something that you see a lot in your time playing with stacks?
Yeah, and not just playing with it, playing against it as well. I see that same thing where I get that enjoyment. Like, sure, I can run a bunch of counter spells and stop my opponents from playing things on the stack, but playing around my own and other people's stacks pieces has always just felt like a little bit of an extra, like a mini game within Magic the Gathering, because someone might have a stacks piece that is directly stopping me. Draenith Magistrate's a good, a commonly seen example of this, where I might really want my commander, but I could also see that the player going right before me, if Draenith Magistrate is gone, they're just going to pop off and they're going to just run away with the game. So that timing becomes much more precise, and you have to be way more strategic about how you remove pieces and how you stop the pieces from coming down. Like, it might not always be the correct choice to counter a stacks piece that directly affects you if based on how the game or how the turn order is, if someone else is going to get benefit from that piece not being there even more. So I really enjoy kind of that extra level of mind games, or that extra level of planning that is kind of brought along with stacks at the table.
Yeah, well said. I definitely have noticed there are situations where someone will blow up a stacks piece and the person going right after the stacks player is the one that wins, if whether or not it's you. So you're like, oh, you really shouldn't have gotten rid of it right then. Maybe a different time. And
there's a lot of like talk about politics and CEDH, and that's one of the things that I'll politic for the most. Is if someone's trying to get rid of a stacks piece, I'm like, wait, hold on, before you get rid of that, are you sure? Are you sure you're going to get the most benefit from this being gone? Or is the person going right before you going to win the game before it gets to your turn? Like, think really hard before you remove that stacks piece, because that could be the determination of this game right there.
100%.
That conversation, I feel like, comes up a lot within our play group, with how much stacks gets played in our play group.
I think that's really cool. One of the things I've also noticed that in playing with stacks is it's a lot harder to quantify the effectiveness of a piece, because when you say I'm casting ad nauseum, I was able to count this many, I was able to get this many cards, I was able to pay this life, and I was able to do these things, and then that's how I was able to win the game. It's so much easier to quantify ad nauseum. I've seen spreadsheets, I've seen charts, I've seen all these different things with things like breach lines. It's so easy to quantify the effectiveness or the power of these types of cards and win cons. It is so much more difficult to quantify when somebody can't do something. Draenith Magistrate is a little bit more on the overt side of it. Oh, they weren't able to cast their commanders anymore, but maybe they were holding an Underworld Breach in their hand and the Draenith was also shutting them off. Maybe the person, you put down a Linvala, Keeper of Silence, on the battlefield. Maybe you potted for it or something. And the person was holding, 3 dorks in their hand or something like that allowed them to be able to finally go off and win. Like Yisan. They had Yisan in their hand and they were going to just go right there. But they didn't play it because the stacks piece stopped them. And it was so much harder to quantify what the effectiveness of that piece was.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to, what we were talking about before with the deck building process of putting stacks in your deck. Like, there's just that extra level of needing to know what the meta is within your play group, or just within, at least when we're talking about CEDH, within the general CEDH ecosphere of decks and what is commonly played. That extra level of research that goes into, slotting in those stacks pieces, is something that I find it enjoyable. But you're right, it is hard to really quantify. Like, you could run a Cursed Totem or a Linvala, and you could be in a pod with no green. It's not common, but it's possible. And then that card just kind of is really just dead. If there's no one using creature abilities, you have a 4-mana creature that doesn't really do too much. So there's a big trade-off there with some of those very specific stacks pieces. But in my opinion, that just adds to the benefit of stacks. Maybe not in the gameplay part of it, but in the deck building part of it, you have to really, you have to think about your card choices. Because like you said, ad nauseum, you can quantify that. You can know exactly, or at least on average, how much value you're going to get from it. You can't do that with a stacks piece, especially a stacks piece that is, that isn't just one-sided and that is very specific. So having to really put extra thought into it, I think, I don't know, for me, just adds to the flavor of stacks a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of times people will frequently call those certain things silver bullet stacks pieces. You'll see that term thrown around a lot. Silver bullet stacks pieces. And a lot of times a silver bullet stacks pieces is just the one that stopped that person from winning. You know, every stacks piece can be a silver bullet in the right situations, which kind of leads into a really interesting topic or question, which is when you're building or when you're approaching a stacks deck, as you said that you've been doing, how do you balance what stacks you put in, what stacks you put out? You talked a little bit about the meta. Walk us through that process a little bit.
Sure. I will preface this by saying I might be a little bit biased here. Maybe bias isn't the right term, but you know, I play with a regular play group, so it's easy to know what I'm playing into. So it's much harder to use maybe my methodology going into a blind meta. But generally, I kind of just come up with an archetype or a deck that I want to build, whether it be commanders or a specific win con, and then I kind of just compile cards that I know or stacks pieces if it's going to be, you know, that kind of deck. Compile cards that I know won't affect me at all. You know, Curse Totem or Null Rod. Like one of those is probably going to affect me, so I'm not going to choose it, but likely I'll choose the other one, and I'll kind of put those in a pile, and then I'll go through and kind of either if I'm playing into a blind meta or if I'm playing into, you know, just my normal play group, I'll kind of just go through and really pick out the cards that I think are going to target popular win cons specifically. So Underworld Breach, you know, is a really good example. That card's, you know, very common. It's a very condensed, concise win con. So, you know, a piece that shuts off Underworld Breach is going to be fairly valuable because it's likely that I'll see an Underworld Breach. Thassa's Oracle is another one, or Demonic Consultation, that combo in general. Rule of Law effects, you know, if I can afford them, can kind of control at least that combo, which is kind of what I gear towards. I try to gear my general stacks pieces towards the more popular combos that I see in either a majority of the decks or you know, a majority of decks that I see either through content that I watch or just going through the database or just going through the list of decks that I know my friends have. So I kind of try to tier them based on how common I'll see other players win cons. So from those two, or from those processes, I kind of have a good selection of cards that don't affect me or affect me minimally, and cards that greatly affect win cons that I think I'm going to see or I'm very likely to see. And after that, depending on how many cards I have in my list and how many stacks pieces I have and how many more I think I can add, I'll start to go towards more value-based pieces or pieces that will stop others' value. Deafening Silence in a way is kind of like that. I know that can also be kind of like a silver bullet piece that does stop some combos, but I consider that less of a hard stop because there are ways around it and people can win around it. So maybe that's not the best example, but a card like that where, you know, I know that's going to stop a good amount of value, especially early game. And if I can get away with running that kind of fits into that tier of, you know, value stopping. And at that point, I've kind of... my deck list is probably full at that point, so I usually don't go too much farther. I would say there might be another bucket of stacks pieces that are stacks pieces that I can directly get around that are going to hurt my opponents. Like I would say in Urza, like in any type of orb, like a Winter Orb, you know, that's going to hurt my opponents, not because of their win cons, not because of their value, just because it's Winter Orb, and I can not only get value from it because it's an artifact, but also completely get around it. So those are, I guess, maybe just special use cases that are just off to the side for very specific decks.
Sure. So based on that, what are some commanders and or maybe strategies or win cons that kind of lend themselves more to stacks than others? Like it's pretty obvious that Storm isn't great in a stacks build. You know, it's pretty obvious. But maybe talk about some of the other win cons that are maybe advantageous for a stacks type approach.
Sure. There's a few different sides to it. Sides that I enjoy going for are the creature-based win cons because I love Deafening Silence. It's just a card I love playing because people hate to see it, but it's one of those cards that doesn't get removed very often because you can play around it, kind of. And it doesn't always affect everyone, so you're not always, you know, that's not always a target. So I like Deafening Silence, and because of that, I like to run creature-based combos. So cards that go along with that, or commanders that go along with that, I think lend itself well to it. I'll go back to Blue Pod. I think back when I was playing Blue Pod, I think Thrasios is a really good way to get around a lot of these stacks pieces. You know, Thrasios and Crom, for example. Just anything that is going to get me this passive value, or maybe not even passive value, active value, while I'm slowing down the board, I think lend themselves very well to Stax decks because I'm slowing my opponents down, but my commanders are directly getting me value. And I think that's important. I think you need to have some type of advantage in the command zone that's going to get you value, because if not, you could frequently put yourself in the same situation you're putting your opponents in, where you're stopping them from doing something, sure, but you don't have a reliable and a surefire way to get that value. And I think that's a very important thing. So I know I didn't give too many specific examples, but I think there could be quite a few. Kenrith, I think, is a good example where he can just get value because he's Kenrith, and you can slot Stax into that and put a win con together. You do have to be careful with cards like Thrasios and Kenrith because it does shut you off from Cursed Totem specifically, I guess. But those commander choices limit you a little bit with what commanders you can run. But I think choosing a commander that has reliable value is important.
That's really interesting. I built an Achromatana deck. Basically, I saw Achroma in action. I was like, this is a really, really great card when paired with something like Odric, or concerted effort or something. And they basically will buff your team with all these keywords, and then she'll literally buff your team. Like, she'll give them +1/+1 for all of them. And I saw myself in a world where I was like, well, Achroma is like 7, and that's a steep price in the old CDH world there. And I was like, sure, I've got Jeweled Lotus, but come on. It's like, I'm not going to be able to race the table. And so when I get into a situation like that, where I'm like, I know I cannot beat somebody, I cannot outrace them through something like an Adnon strategy, or maybe they're on Thoracle or something. I know I can't beat that. I immediately start to look at what stacks can help bring them down to my pace. And I chose Achromatana, which is Naya Stax, because of, like you said, these abilities that give me the ability to slow down. And I don't care if I can only play one card a turn through one spell turn through something like Rule of Law. Mm-hmm. I care about these triggered abilities and slowly accruing this incremental advantage by compiling on top of each other. And what you said just now was actually pretty interesting, because I never quite thought about it like this, but you're right. Creature-heavy strategies do kind of lend themselves more to stacks. Achromatana, Najeela, there's a Stax build of Najeela, Stax build of Derevi, Urza, which, maybe not. It's kind of an artifact build. But so I think that's a really interesting thought that you have about creatures and, the strategies and stuff like that. Is there anything else that someone would want to think about when they're thinking about an initial Stax plan, or maybe even building a deck thinking with Stax in mind?
I would say, more than anything, make sure that you're not building a deck that just slows down your opponents. I think it is very important to make sure you can get around these pieces, that you can win through these pieces, and that these pieces not only slow down your opponents, but also propel you forward, in a sense. Like, maybe they're not getting you direct value. Maybe this card isn't drawing you a card, but you don't need to draw cards to win the game, maybe. For example, Spirit of the Labyrinth is the card that I had in mind. Make sure that playing Spirit of the Labyrinth isn't going to stop you from winning or stop you from getting ahead, because it is very important. And I think we'll get into this probably later, but it does get very feels bad when you play a Stax piece that hurts you as much as it hurts everyone else. It's slowing down everyone else, but it's also slowing down you, and it's really just dragging the game on. I think that's important to make sure that you don't, or that you're focused on being able to propel yourself forward through these Stax pieces. I think that's probably, and that lends itself to the commander choice and the card choice, like we talked about earlier. But I think that's a very important part of that deck building process.
I think that's actually a really interesting lesson learned, if you will, where you're like, oh, well, I can't really do this because it's slowing down me as well. And look, I've got like 2 cards in hand, and this really is hurting me just as much. What would you say might be a few other quote unquote lessons learned, if you will, approaches to when you were piloting and building stacks? What was some stuff that you might recommend to somebody who's looking into this that you're like, maybe steer clear of this or be aware of this?
Generally, be open-minded to cutting cards that you like. There might be a Stax piece you really like, but that card, either within the meta or within your deck or within the pod, just might not be good. And I've run into this many times because I have pet cards. I have cards, specifically Stax pieces, that have won me the game, or maybe not directly won me the game, but stopped other people from winning the game directly. And I really like that card, but it's so niche. It's so silver bullet that it's that once in 20 games kind of silver bullet where it's very, very specific. And I think you need to make sure that more than in other styles of decks, you need to be open-minded to cutting cards that have done well for you, because this isn't a draw spell. This isn't a counter spell. This isn't a reanimation spell. This doesn't do anything for you. All it's doing is really slowing down your opponent so you can get there faster. And if it's not reliably doing that, then it's probably not a good piece. I think a card like, at least in my experience, Tanglewire is a card like that. Is a card that fits that definition for me. I've run Tanglewire and it's done really well for me. Getting an early Tanglewire has done really well for me in certain games. But there's other games where it just doesn't do much. It just kind of, my board state's not in a position where I can deal with Tanglewire, and it just adds 4 turns to a game. Like, it doesn't do too much. It doesn't help me win. And, I'm not saying Tanglewire is a bad card, but in the decks that I was running it in, maybe it wasn't the best choice because the one game that it really let me get ahead wasn't worth, the 15 where it sat in my hand doing nothing. So I think being able to be open-minded about cards and being able to swap and test out new cards or different cards that really get you that reliable value, and get you that reliable value by giving your opponents anti-value, I guess. So I think just being open-minded about card selection is just very important when you're dealing with a permanent piece that targets a specific effect.
All right, so let's talk about, now that we've spoken to the idea of building stacks and maybe getting some of these pieces out and maybe talking about tuning for your meta, let's talk about getting in the cockpit. Let's talk about actually piloting stacks. What are some tips and advice you would give on how to pilot stacks, how to do it effectively, maybe some tips for newcomers? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure. I think a lot of what I'm going to say applies to a lot of different archetypes or deck styles. But I think one of the most important things, and this is going to seem just very obvious, but your opening hand is so important. If you're playing a deck that relies on slowing down your opponents, you have to be much more picky, maybe not than every other style of deck, but you need to be very picky with what cards you keep in your opening hand. If you keep an opening hand that's full of value, but your deck is a stacks-based deck, that card is much less valuable than it is in someone else's deck, because you might have a little bit of card draw, you might have a lot of ramp, but if you're not actively slowing down your opponents with this stacks-based deck, then you're just letting them do what you're trying to stop, and you're not able to stop them with what's in your hand. So I think more than anything, understanding the pod that you're at, take a look at the commanders you're playing against if you have that opportunity, and pick an opening hand that you think has some gas, sure, maybe has a little bit of ramp, but also has some pieces that you think will let you stay in the game and will prevent your opponents from winning. If you're looking at the table and you see a lot of Dimir or black and blue in their colors, and you have a Torp Orb in your hand, that card becomes pretty valuable. But if you have a handful of a few lands, a Mana Crypt, a Soul Ring, you're going to get 15 mana on turn 2. You can't do anything with it. You can't stop their Oracle from coming down. You can't stop them from playing multiple spells. You can't stop them from drawing cards. You had a great hand if it was another deck, but in your deck, you're not doing what your deck should be doing. So I think really paying attention to the pod before choosing your opening hand, like I said, if you have that opportunity, and really choosing an opening hand that plays to your strengths, which is slowing down specific win cons. I think that's important.
That's
so
interesting.
Kind of starting off there, I think is, an obvious place to start, start of the game opening hand, but I think that's a really good place to look at. And I think it's easy to practice because you can goldfish hands so easily on a lot of popular deck building websites. Just look at an opening hand, really go through the cards, and kind of value that opening hand. Is this an opening hand that will slow down win cons I'm expecting to go against? Is this going to help me win turn 3, or is this going to help me stop an opponent from winning turn 3 by playing something early on? I think that's something that is good to practice and good to keep in mind when piloting these kind of decks.
So what about in certain situations where you've gotten your opening hand, you're against maybe a Tymna Thrasios, a Tevish Crom, and maybe some other deck, maybe it's another pod deck or something like that, and you see a couple of opening hands, what do you tend to favor against certain win cons when it comes to your opening hand? You said, yes, don't puke out your hand, get a bunch of value, you got nowhere to go with it. But what would you consider to be things that wouldn't be just super overt? Like, for example, Curse Totem is great against Thrasios, but, I wasn't able to get Curse Totem in my opening hand. What else can I do against this TNT deck? Talk to me maybe about a couple sample openers that might be good against something like that.
I think an important thing to keep in mind there is hedging your bets. I think is beneficial when playing against a bunch of different deck types. Things that you'll need multiple pieces to stop. I think hedging your bets on which is the biggest threat is important. Especially keeping in mind turn order. I think it's okay more in this style of deck, which is generally maybe less interactive and more proactive or more preventative. I think it's okay to rely on opponents. I think it's okay to keep in mind, if someone else is playing a heavy control deck against, a Tymna Thrasios or a very fast Ad Naus deck, and you think you really need to focus on keeping the opening hand that focuses on one of them, and you don't have the ability to keep one that focuses on both of them, rely on your opponents and treat them as pseudo teammates in a sense, and use turn order to your advantage to pick which of those opponents that you can really stop. You obviously can't pick the 7 ideal cards, but when looking through your opening hands, you should have enough pieces to reliably have one in your opening hand that stops something that's meta or popular that's going on at the table. Generally, like you said, you can't stop everyone. You can't stop 2 people that are playing fast and strong decks. So relying on turn order to determine who you can stop, if that's an option, or just relying on control players and really putting it in their court to try to handle maybe the faster pace. Because I think one thing to keep in mind with these Stax-based decks is you're not generally the deck that's going to be the fastest to churn out a win or be the fastest to churn out like an early Ad Naus. Maybe you might be. I mean, it's possible. A lot of these decks run compact win cons, which can win quickly. But that's generally not what you're going for. And if you are kind of backed into a corner where you have to deal with multiple things, like I said, hedge your bets. Decide who you can stop. Kind of focus more on that, and you do have to rely a little bit on the control player to stop that person, and you can use that to your advantage as well. If you think someone is running a fast Ad Naus deck that you can't really deal with, but someone's running a heavy control deck, use that to your advantage. Wait till they go off, play your stacks to target that third person, stop them from working and from playing the game effectively. And then once the control player deals with the Ad Naus deck, that opens you up a little bit to kind of do what you want to do. So like we talked about earlier, it's a little bit more of a strategic, a little bit more of a planning play style. But I don't think relying on your opponents is necessarily a bad thing when going into a situation where, you're keeping an open hand of 5 cards and you can't really do a whole lot to everybody at the table, and you really got to pick one thing to focus on.
I think that's really neat because what you basically described is almost the inverse of what so many other decks kind of want to do when it comes to things like evaluating their opening hands. You talked a lot about table position, which maybe a Grixis Ad Naus deck would take some consideration into. They're like, well, where am I? Okay, I'm first. I'm going to go, whereas maybe, I'm fourth. I'll see what they do before I plan this out. And what Stax appears to want to do is see not what they're doing, but literally what everyone else is doing. What seeding order am I in? What are they playing? What is their general plan? What should I do to do that? That's an interesting metric that not a lot of decks do very frequently. And I think that's a really cool aspect of Stax that not a lot of people talk about.
Yeah, like you said earlier, it's just that extra level of looking at a game. It's the mini game. It's playing chess in a game of checkers. Like there's just that extra level of stuff to plan for, and it just makes it a little bit more enjoyable than just kind of keeping up mana and trying to counter someone's win con. Which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I enjoy countering. I enjoy casting a mana drain to stop an Ad Naus as much as the next guy, but that extra level of planning is also something that I think is a little bit unique to a stack style of deck.
Cool. So we talked about the opening hand. We talked about the general thing, like with seeding order and stuff like that. Walk me through maybe like a typical game where you're the stacks pilot. Maybe talk a little bit about early game, a little bit about mid game, a little bit about late game. Walk me just briefly through each of those and what you should expect and or do being a stacks player.
Sure. I think one thing to expect when we're talking about the early game is that you're probably not going to run out as much rampant value as other people because you are playing some preventative pieces. A turn one Thalia, if you're, going first, is going to be huge. But that's not really getting you any value. It's not pushing you ahead. So being prepared to have a little bit of a more slow start or an on-curve play style, in a sense, I think is okay. I think just being ready and being prepared to play those cards that are going to stop people from playing their turn one effectively, but also you're not playing your turn one. You're not throwing down mana rocks. You're not casting your commander. You're playing a 2-mana creature. But that 2-mana creature does a lot for you, and you have to look at that card and really determine how much value you're getting from it. And generally, if you're playing that turn one and you're going first, that's huge. And the next turn, you kind of get your turn two. You get 2 lands. And you can kind of progress from there while everyone else is still kind of on turn one. And the benefit that you have is you get to plan for it. Your deck is built to handle it a little bit better, and you knew you were going to cast that. So you can plan your next few turns accordingly. So that's an advantage you have. So I think, talking about the early game, I think that's just something to keep in mind, is that plan to have a little bit less of an explosive start, but make sure to value what your stacks pieces are doing when evaluating that start. Throughout the game and getting into the mid game, I think making sure that you tutor the right pieces, and that's weird to say because generally you want to just tutor win cons. You're not always able to. I think tutoring a piece to stop someone's win con can be very strong. A mid game collector oof is huge, can be huge. Not always huge, and that's something to keep in mind, but using a tutor to stop someone from playing the game, I think is a valuable in a realistic mid-game play. If you don't have any of your win cons in hand and you only have one tutor, but someone is poised to win, don't be scared to hold on to that tutor, or don't be scared to play it early, rather than hold on to it and hope that someone else can stop them. I know I said earlier, sometimes rely on your teammates, but if you have the ability to tutor up, with an Eldritch Evolution and just put something on the battlefield that's going to stop someone from winning, that is very valuable to keep in mind during the mid game. Just not being scared to use an Enlightened tutor to tutor up a Rule of Law if you need it. Be a little bit more liberal with your tutoring. Now, that's not always the case. Obviously, tutoring up a win con is important and is going to win you the game, but that's not always possible. I think a similar correlation is tutoring up a counterspell. It's a little bit of a feels bad if you're tutoring that to stop someone else. But as the stacks player, if you tutor up a stacks piece, that's not a single use counterspell. I think if you're thinking of it, kind of drawing the line from tutoring a counterspell to tutoring a stacks piece, I think you're getting more value from tutoring a stacks piece. Because it's more permanent based it's not interaction, but a more permanent based effect that will not only stop someone from winning, but will continue to get value throughout the game by slowing down your opponent. So within the mid game, if you're not poised to win early, just keep in mind that playing pieces specifically to stop opponents is okay. And I think that might be something that people who aren't used to playing stacks decks may not be comfortable with. I only have experience based on the other people within Casually Competitive who started to play stacks who may not be who weren't familiar with it towards the beginning. That's something that I think takes a little bit of getting used to. It's different than a spell slingy deck because the pieces that you tutor up stick around and they're going to continue to stop someone from playing the game. So using that tutor rather than just crossing your fingers and hoping that someone else stops them and wins the game, using your tutors is fine in that situation. And then moving on to the late game, I think as you're planning from mid to late game, it's important to plan those stacks pieces around what your win con is going to be. I think it's pretty easy in any kind of deck to know what you're going for pretty early on, whether it be Underworld Breach line or a Kiki Jiki line, depending on which what deck you're playing. It's pretty easy to kind of tell what direction you're going. So throughout the game and moving into the late game, I think it's important to always keep what your win con is in mind. Don't play a stacks piece that is going to stop down what your primary win con is going to be in that game. You might have a stacks piece. I don't know why you would run this, but there might be a situation where you have a Torp Orb and a Kiki Jiki. Probably not a very realistic example, but just the first two cards I thought of. Just making sure that that you don't play the Torpor Orb too early if you are going for that Kiki Jiki win con. And I think that's something that you just need to keep in mind throughout the entire game. And then as it gets into the late game, as you're in this late game, you're poised to win. Your Stax pieces are your best friends in this situation. Being able to win through a rule of law is huge because your opponents can't do too much to stop you. They can cast one spell per turn, but if you're able to, or maybe not a rule of law in that situation, but a deafening silence, I guess, is a better example, where you can play all these creatures and they can only counter one thing each. They can only cast one non-creature spell. So really relying on your Stax pieces to be your pseudo interaction, I think, is really what you need to focus on getting into that late game and while you're attempting to win the game.
Very cool. So talk to me quickly, now that we're talking about the late game, some common win cons that you would see in a Stax game. From a Stax deck. Yeah.
Well, like I said, I might be a little biased with my answers here, but I love Hullen, and I may not play it in the most optimal way, but I play mine with a lot of hate bears and a lot of light to maybe some heavier Stax pieces because I like it and I think it's fun. I think it's in good colors for it, and I think it does a lot of what I've talked about, where it gets around a lot of the Stax pieces effectively. So in that situation, win con is just Mana Breach. And I think it's a good Stax piece that's also a win con. So then that might be a very niche example because it's one of my favorite commanders and one of my favorite decks that I've built. But in that situation, it's a win con that involves creatures. You can play Deafening Silence in that deck and you can win through it. You may need to destroy it. You may need to use your one non-creature spell to destroy it, but you can draw your deck with a Shrieking Drake line that allows you to just play creatures in order to draw your deck, and then you only have one non-creature spell to cast, but you have your entire deck in your hand, so you have a lot of options available to you. So that's one example. Another one that I've played frequently is Kiki Jiki lines, just because I think they're easy to get out with either Birthing Pod, or they're easy to play around Stax pieces with, because a lot of Stax pieces, like I said, you either pick kind of the Null Rod avenue or the Cursed Totem avenue. You don't often run both effects in your deck. But you can go heavy in the Null Rod avenue and then run creature-based win cons, and I think that's something that I've personally done fairly frequently. And then there's another bucket that I don't tread into often because it's fun to pilot, but only maybe a few times every few months, which is the lock-based decks, which is something like Possibility Storm, which is a card I love. I absolutely love that card, and I think Possibility Storm locks are very fun. And you can easily build a Stax-based deck around Possibility Storm, or something like Lavinia Omen Pool lines, where you're playing these Stax pieces, a little bit unorthodox Stax pieces, as they're maybe not preventing your opponents from playing, but they're playing in a very different way, and then you can play cards to stop them from playing in this new way of playing the game. The Draenith Magistrate stops them from playing cards that aren't in their hands, and now they can't do anything with these cards. So I think those are, it doesn't obviously cover all of the possible win cons within Stax, but I think personally ones that I've enjoyed playing are either creature-based win cons like Hullen with Shrieking Drake, or Kiki Jiki lines, or the super hard lock decks where you really focus on slowing down the game and eventually just slamming this lock piece with Lavinia or with Draenith Magistrate and Possibility Storm or something like that. So, like I said, it might not be a comprehensive list, but those are the kind of win cons that I've always leaned towards.
One of the earliest Stax decks most people will run into when playing CEDH is the classic Blood Pod. Mm-hmm. Blood Pod is the classic deck that you'll see a lot of times when people are talking about Stax and CEDH. And one of the things that I noticed from Blood Pod, as well as just any sort of CEDH Stax, is that it usually tends to be able to enable certain more convoluted win cons. Classic examples are Blood Pod lines, where you have Birthing Pod plus this what would be considered pretty super intricate line with these branching paths and stuff like that, which is a lot of fun to execute, but requires a lot more thought. And it's so easily disruptible because of this factor and this factor and this third factor in your opponents, and this person can do this and they've got mana up. And you have all these things that can shut down because of what kind of setup is required in order to be able to run these lines. But when when you're able to put stacks into the equation, now you have a system where I can activate Birthing Pod a whole bunch of times, not cast a spell at all, and win the game. So you can get around rule of law effects. You can make sure that most people's interaction is stack-based interaction, or it's permanent removal or something like that, and you have multiple pieces that they have to remove in order to be able to beat you. And I think that's such a really cool part of stacks that people don't always see in the beginning is, well, we live in a Thorical world, we live in a Nas world, we live in a Breach world, you can't play that stuff. Well, actually you can. If you put stacks into your components of your deck building, you might be able to add a conspicuous Snoop line, which is, I love that card. It's such a great card, and it doesn't get played enough. I'm just saying that now. Everyone needs to start building Snoop. And you can do things like that with this like crazy pile that you set up with, your Goblin Recruiter and all this stuff and set it up and make it work. And now all of a sudden you have the ability to do this because you put stacks into the equation and now set up a world where you say, okay, now it's my turn. I get to do what I want. And that's a lot of fun. And people don't always think about that when they think about stacks.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Being able to play different things because you're stopping people from interacting and you're stopping people from winning with the normal things, I think is definitely a really cool aspect of it.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked about piloting stacks. We talked about why maybe somebody would approach stacks. We talked about building stacks. Now let's talk about when stacks isn't in your favor. Let's talk about what are some tips and advice you'd give someone who sees stacks from across the table. How do you pilot against stacks? How do you win through stacks?
My biggest suggestion whenever anyone talks about this is plan your win con, like based on when that card is cast. Start planning your win to win with that on the battlefield. Unless that stops every single win con, plan on not removing that piece, because chances are if that's stopping you, it's also stopping the guy next to you, and you want that guy stopped. You don't want to be stopped, but if you have a win con that can get around that, go for that win con, even if it really messes with your first turn or two. If someone drops a turn 3 piece that really is affecting you, like I said, chances are it's affecting the other players at the table as well. And first off, you can never be the first one to remove the stacks piece, because if you remove that stacks piece, someone else is going to win immediately after. So you have to make sure that if you are still planning on winning by removing that stacks piece, you remove it at the perfect time, or just gear your win to win around it with it on the battlefield so you can use that stacks piece to your advantage. I think stacks is great to play against because it adds that extra level of thought, and it also kind of gives you a little bit of a cushion as well. If you're able to win through a rule of law, even if it's a little more convoluted, that gives you protection. You now have the protection that the stacks player wants, but you didn't have to cast it. You didn't have to spend 3 mana to cast it. And I think learning to play around that, and obviously it's not always the case. Sometimes it really does completely stop your deck. Rule of law, probably a bad example, because if your deck's not built to play around it, you probably can't. But playing around the stacks pieces by not removing them, not planning to remove them, I think is very important. I think that should always be kind of your first thought is, if that remains on the battlefield all game, can I still win? If so, what steps do I need to do in order to win with that on the battlefield? Using other players' stacks to your advantage, I think, is just a huge upside.
Interesting. So, talking about seeing the stacks pieces on the board, what do you do if something is shutting you down? Like it's hard locking you out of this game. And yes, it may be stopping the people next to you, but talk to me a little bit maybe about timing, or maybe about approach. Hey, somebody gave me the silver bullet and my breach deck doesn't work because Draneth is on the field. Talk to me the thought process about, okay, how am I going to win now?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, it really all just comes down to timing, because a card like Draneth Magistrate's a good example. If you're playing against at least one other commander-based win con, you need to make sure that you remove that Draneth Magistrate at the exact right time, because you don't want the other person to win. You need to either make sure that you can both remove that Draneth and stop someone from winning, or you can remove that Draneth at the exact right time to where only you will get the benefit from it. It is just kind of a boring answer, but I think just timing is just going to be the only answer there. It's like like I said, the two things is you need to be able to make sure that you can stop someone else from winning with that piece gone if the turn order doesn't allow it. If you can only remove that piece right now, everyone's tapped out, and this spell would get countered, this removal spell would get countered if they had mana. But there's a person in between, the current turn and your turn, and they might be able to win with that Drannith Magistrate gone. You have to make sure that you can stop that person from potentially winning, because you removing that Drannith Magistrate may have just saved your opponent 1 or 2 mana, and now they can do their win con because they were 1 or 2 mana short. So you need to make sure that you can handle the kickback. You need to make sure that you can handle what's to come if someone does have a turn in between those, in between that timing, and if the opportunity presents itself to where you can remove this piece and be the only person to get the benefit from it, that's obviously best case. But it's always hard for me to plan for best case scenario because best case scenario never ends up happening. But that is best case scenarios: removing Drannith Magistrate and then winning. Removing it on the end step of the person who goes before you. That's the dream. No one counters the removal, and you're free to have a Drannith Magistrate free list turn. That's the dream, but how often does that actually get to happen?
Not as much as it should, that's for sure. All right, let's talk about the bane of every Grixis player's existence. 2 Stax decks at the table. Okay, so you're a Stax deck, but you're also playing against one. How do you come on top when your strategies are so similar? Give me maybe some tips and advice for someone. You're on Bloodpaw and they're on Urza, or maybe vice versa, and the Grixis guys are just like, I guess I'll play a game on my phone because I'm not doing anything this game. So, as a Stax player against a Stax player, what's some tips or advice you give there?
My advice actually, is a little weird here. I think in that situation, you need to not be the person to play the most aggressive stacks. Because the person who plays the most aggressive stacks, if you're one of the 2 Stax decks, and there's 2 players who really get shut off by even just the lightest of stacks, you don't want to be the person whose stacks pieces are being targeted. You want to be very selective with what you cast, because if you're the one targeted, then your board's just going to get disrupted, and it might be a little bit of a mental game at that point. People are just going to target you more often if you're playing the more harsh pieces. I would say in that situation, you really want to pick Stax pieces to play that target 1 to 2 players, ideally the other Stax player, depending on what the 2 archetypes are. If you're both playing the same type of deck, it's going to be pretty difficult. But if you do have a Stax piece that affects one of the Grixis players and the other Stax deck, that's ideal, because now you have a Grixis player on your team who's kind of ruined for you to keep that Stax piece around. You just kind of want to make sure, and it's not always possible, but I always try to make sure that in that situation, I'm not hurting both of the non-Stax players more than the other Stax players hurting those 2 players. You definitely want to kind of lie low. You don't want to be the ultimate target because you just become the target. And generally, when you have 2 people against you, you don't really have the interaction to deal with that. And depending on the situation and the pod structure, the other Stax deck could also be shutting you down. So you're playing a Stax piece to shut down the 2 spell slingers, but now the other Stax deck is shutting you down. So you can't do anything. You're stopping the 2, the 2, Grixis players from doing anything, from winning with consoles. So now they're both targeting you. You're being shut down by the Stax player, and you're just having a bad time. So it's a little bit of a different mindset, I think, going into it, and it's a weird mindset because you're not playing the most ideal card that will do the most good or get you the most value, I guess you could say. But I think really choosing which pieces to play is important there, because you want to make sure that you can have at least someone on your team that is going to, that you can use to your advantage, I guess, to help get out of whatever situation the other players are putting you in.
That's interesting. And you talked about teammates, and you talked about, forming these alliances or something like that. And that actually brings up a really good question. So Stax has a stigma to it, and we'll talk about that in more detail in just a second. But Stax, you generally kind of tend to be the enemy at the table just by saying I'm a Stax player. Mm-hmm. How do you incorporate politics into a Stax game plan as the pilot?
I personally generally don't incorporate Stax too much if I'm the one playing the Stax. The most politicking I'll do is choose Stax pieces that are shutting off the person who's doing the most in the game. That wins me a little bit of favor sometimes, but I mean, that's usually just the right play to do anyway. So it's not really a choice based on politics. It's just a choice based on gameplay. And sometimes it gets me a little bit of favor and helps me, like I said, slide under the radar a little bit. Really, I try to just let the spell choice or the cards I choose to cast kind of gain me that favor. And like I said, a lot of the stacks that I like to play will not target everyone all at the same time unless the pod is very similar. Unless the other 3 decks are very similar, my Stax pieces aren't going to affect everyone at the same time. So it really, and when I say teammate, I really mean your opponent that you can use to your advantage. It really lets you use those people as a pseudo teammate because they're not targeting you, and now you're not affecting them. They're not going to stop you as much because they're focused on stopping the other people trying to remove your Stax piece. So it's kind of like a little bit of a buffer, and it's not always reliable, and you can't always depend on it. But it does garner you a little bit of favor, and it does give you a little bit of a bartering chip in a sense, because if that Stax piece is gone, now this player next to me can win the game. So this other person who the Stax piece isn't affecting is more inclined to help protect that piece.
Very interesting. I've found that in my experience, because there is sometimes, to be said, an inherent disadvantage to playing the slowest, if you will. You can't power out certain things because your deck doesn't play that way. You can't race ahead of everybody else, maybe like Grixis Nas does. So you have to find a way to be able to keep everyone at your level, even if you don't have all perfect 7 Stax pieces in your hand. So a lot of times I've seen really good Stax players say to the board little politicking cues that aren't even super overt, like, hey, let's form an alliance, buddy, pal of mine, and I need you to kill that. They don't say that. They usually do things like subtle cues, which I think is super interesting. I've seen Stax players say things like, uh-oh, that's a big problem, even if it's not as big a problem to the rest of the table. But they really start to get into the head games part of it, which I think is cool. They're like, oh, guys, we got to remove this right now. This is a problem. What are you going to do about it, player B? And you'll call them by name. What are you going to do about that, Ryan? Well, wait, don't play that because that's on the board and we're done. We're done in one turn. And just seeing that kind of stuff I see that the most coming from Stax players. Because they will, like you said, they'll forge these frenemy alliance kind of things and really put a lot more of that work into the game than somebody who's just like, I'm going to go quick, and if you stop me, I'm going to try it again.
Yeah, and maybe I misspoke a little bit. I think that is actually very common. I'll really explain what's going on if I think someone is eyeing one of my pieces, or if someone is presenting a pretty viable threat, and someone else is trying to remove something or trying to interact in a way, really explaining the situation to make sure that they know that, like, hey, that's super dangerous and this is shutting them down. Don't remove this. I don't care how much you want to play your commander. Those conversations, like you said, are very frequent. And honestly, I never really thought of them as direct politics, but yeah, I think in a sense, yeah, you're right. There is that extra level of kind of mind game and making sure, you might not be lying, but you might be overemphasizing something, and the person you're accusing can't really deny it. What are they going to do? Say, oh, I'm not a threat? Like, obviously that just makes them more of a threat.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, it really does work in your favor in those situations. That's
really cool. Yeah. All right. So I mentioned it earlier, so let's talk about it now. And I've said it throughout this podcast already. Stax has a stigma to it. And that stigma is kind of what I've been trying to skirt this whole thing, is that Stax is unfun. From the outside looking in, that's what everyone always says that Stax is. Stax, that is not fun. You're not fun. You're a griefer. You're somebody who just wants to make it so that everyone's miserable, and that's how you play the game, and I don't like you, and so on and so forth. But that's not really true. I have experience playing Stax, and I know that that's not true. But from the outside looking in, that does sometimes look like what it seems. So why would you say there is such a negative stigma around Stax? And maybe as a follow-up, how can we take steps to shed those stigmas?
The way that I've always seen it is Stax really has a negative stigma because when it's played improperly, it really slows down the game. It makes them unfun. When you play a Winter Orb and can't directly get around it, you're slowing the game down for everyone and you're not winning off of it. It's much different, and this is more prevalent in I would say more casual environment where there's less interaction, but it really is worse than someone who's running a fast combo in a casual environment, because at least at that point the game's over. The game's over, they won, it was unfair, it was over, it was, the power level was definitely, there was a mismatch there. But in that same situation, if someone plays a really aggressive Stax piece but doesn't have the deck to back it up, now you just turned a 1 hour game into a 3 hour game. That's miserable for everyone because no one can play the game of Magic. At least in the first example, we can just shuffle up and play again, maybe have a conversation about power levels, let's play something a little bit more consistent. But with playing an unoptimized Stax deck that's not built to really play that Stax, you're just making a really long, unfun game for everyone involved. And I think that's really where a lot of the stigma has come in. It's people see it as, that's an unfun card, and if someone played that in the kind of decks that I play with, that would just make the game 6 hours long and no one would be able to play anything because we're only untapping one land a turn. And I think it really looks bad from the outside because there are situations where people play it improperly and people play it with the intention of just slowing down the game and not the intention of winning after that. And to follow up, I think the way to get around the stigma is making sure that if you are slotting in a Stax piece that doesn't directly help you, just don't. If you aren't slotting in a piece that you can play around, if you aren't slotting in a piece in a deck that can win with that, if you're just slotting in a piece to slow the game down, I think that's a really poor choice for a card slot. It comes back to just being a little bit mean, a little bit. You're making the game grindy when it's not necessary. I mean, Magic the Gathering, even at a CEDH level, is just a game. People are meant to have fun, and really playing a piece that isn't helping anything and is really just slowing down the game. Like, let's say you slot in Winter Orb and your plan is, I'm going to play one land a turn until I can play a 12 mana spell, and my plan is to not cast anything on my turn, so I'm fine, but everyone else wants to cast some big stompy creatures, and now they can't. They're tapping 7 mana the turn before, played Winter Orb, and now they take 7 turns to untap those lands, and everyone's upset. I can't win through it because I need 5 more turns for the 5 mana that I need, and it just creates a bad time just in general. And I think it's not as prevalent in CEDH because there's more interaction, there are faster and more concise win cons, and Stax decks generally are built to be able to win with the Stax pieces around. But I think the more casual and even the onlooker environment is really where it gets the negative stigma from, because it does look like a mean card and people kind of associate that with their games. Even if they haven't seen a heavy Stax piece played in their pods, they can associate it with the kind of games that they play, which are more slow, maybe more casual, and playing a Stax piece into those environments seems preventative. It seems really unfun. And I think that's probably where a lot of the stigma comes from. And like I said, the best way to get around that is, if you are going to play a Stax piece, make sure there's a reason for it and make sure that you can still win the game in a reasonable amount of time with it on the battlefield.
I think that's really interesting, especially because there's a lot of points to that. There's, like you said, the carryover from casual into a more competitive environment of EDH. When you're carrying over, these types of notions and things like that, you can definitely have this look of negative towards Stax. You're like, oh man, I remember one time I played that in my casual pod and I hated it, and I don't know why anybody would ever want to play it. Whereas, when you're carrying that over maybe from competitive to casual, maybe you have a little bit more of an idea of a better approach to it. Mm-hmm. The quintessential thing that I see a lot of times, which comes to maybe poorly assessing the value of a Stax piece, is Armageddon. Mm-hmm. Some people say Armageddon's not Stax. Some people say it is. Form of resource denial. Maybe that's a topic for another podcast. But some people will say, the green player is ramping out of control. I need to be able to stop the green player. It's just like Wrath of God. You create a ton of elves or vampires or whatever tokens it might be, and you've completely created all this advantage. I should be able to stop it, so I will cast Wrath of God. Well, the same thing maybe in a green player ramping out of control's perspective, my snap judgment might be to play Armageddon. Mm-hmm. Oh, you overextended your resources, now they're all gone. But Wrath of God and Armageddon definitely do not get the same sort of stigma to it.
Right.
And why would you say that is? Why would you think that those two, while still removing resources, have such a polar opposite effect on one another?
I think there might be 2 reasons that I just kind of instantly thought of when you brought this up. The first one is, when you play Wrath of God, people are still playing Magic. People still have mana sources available to them, especially in a more casual environment. I still have my 9 lands. I can still cast something next turn. I still have a few cards in my hand. I can still do something. And generally, when the person is casting Wrath of God, they're either not playing a creature-based deck or they have something big to play right after it. So they're following it up with something that's still impactful. And I think that's pretty important. When you play a big removal piece or a big resource denial piece, following it up with something impactful that puts you ahead just makes it make sense. It's like, oh, I see why you destroyed all the creatures. That makes sense. Now you have the best board state. But when you play something like Armageddon, which, like you said, whether or not it's a Stax piece is really not the point. I think it kind of fits the same kind of stigma. When you play Armageddon, I can't play Magic anymore. If I'm not playing fast mana rocks and we're on turn 9 and I've just played a land every turn, maybe I've ramped out a little bit too hard and I'm on 11 lands. I can't play Magic anymore, and neither can you. And I think a lot of times when people play Wrath of God, they're playing it in decks where they can't take advantage of it directly. So this goes back to what I mentioned before, where it just drags the game on. We're all starting back from turn 1 after an hour and a half, after all of our cool cards are gone. Have fun. You don't have 7 cards in your hand like we had on real turn 1. You have 3 cards in your hand. So let's go for another 2 hours. And it's just not fun for anyone. You're playing resource denial without immediately being able to take advantage and be impactful off of it, but you're also directly stopping everybody from playing the game. Like I said, at least with Wrath of God, people are able to play around it. They can still tap their lands for mana. They can still cast things that are in their hand. They can recast their commander, or at least plan to recast. Maybe it's a little bit earlier on in the game. Their commander got destroyed and they have to wait 2 turns to recast their commander. Sure. But at least I can plan for that, and I can expect, or I can at least see what's going to happen in 2 turns. I can at least do something. There's some thoughts going on in my mind. When all my lands are destroyed and I have no lands anymore in my hand, no ramp cards left, what am I going to do? I'm going to top deck and play a land per turn and hopefully get somewhere. But it's nothing that I can do reliably. And I think removing that reliability without following it up with something that's really impactful and really game-ending, especially in this situation, really just leads to a lot of grindy games that are unnecessary and leads to a lot of feels bad moments.
Interesting. So coming full circle around that, so Armageddon Pass is the quintessential do not do this kind of thing. All right, your turn. I hope you draw a land or whatever. But where do you find the balance? Where does this butter zone lie between Armageddon Pass and everyone hates you for it versus Derevi Winter Orb and I'm able to break parity and close out the game in 3 turns? Where's that balance lie, or how do you try to find that balance when it comes to Stax?
I think it really depends on the expectation of the pod. I think that plays a big part into it more than other decks really need to worry about. I think you really need to know what you're getting into. It's hard to go into a blind pod with a heavy Stax deck because you don't know what the other players are expecting. And like I said before, even at a CEDH level, Magic is still a game, and it's important to make sure that everyone's having a good time. And if you're not going into a pod knowing that everyone is playing interaction and playing things that can handle something like an Armageddon or a Winter Orb Derevi based list, I think it just tends to be less of an enjoyable time for most of the people. I think CDH gets around with this pretty easily because there's a baseline expectation for what the decks are going to be able to handle, and I think that's at least in our play group something that we really enjoy, and is why we really took to CDH. So I think in that part of EDH, it's not as much of a problem because there's that level of expectation. I can assume my opponents are going to have interaction. I can assume my opponents can remove this if they need to. But as you get to the more nebulous power levels, or at least nebulous pods, where you don't know what you're getting into going into it, I think that's really where you need to take a step back and really consider, is this going to be an enjoyable time for not only everyone else, but also just myself? Am I going to have a good time playing this into a blind pod? I think being familiar with the people you're playing against helps that out a little bit, because if they're familiar with your deck, you're familiar with their decks, you know what they can handle, you have a general idea. Even if they're bringing a new deck to the table, you have a general idea of what they're going to be able to deal with. So just that familiarity, and like I said, the expectation of the decks you're going against, and just kind of always going in with the mindset of, I'm trying to have a good time and I want everyone to have a good time. So I want to win, but I also don't want to play a 3-hour game that nobody enjoys and just walks away a little disgruntled. So I think more than most decks, you really need to make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into with what you're what pod you're playing into and with who you're playing with. I think that's pretty important.
And with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap it up. So really, really big thanks to Joseph again for coming on the show. I've learned a lot about Stax. There's definitely some things that I'm probably going to do to my Chromatana deck now, kind of learning about some of the stuff and even just some of the approaches that you talked about in taking that I need to think about what everyone else is doing kind of style. I think that's really, really cool. So really big thanks again, Joseph, for being on. Tell everyone where they can find you and maybe some stuff you have coming up.
You can find us on Casually Competitive MTG on YouTube, Casually MTG on Twitter. And if you follow our Twitter, we've got some announcements in the near future. So just keep a lookout on that if you're interested. But just thanks again for having us on. Ryan, it's been fun. It's not often I get to sit down and just talk about Stax, just on a conversation basis. So it's been fun. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a blast. So thank you for being on. It's been great. All right. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Really quick shout out again to our sponsors. That's TCG Player, that is Dragon Shield, and all of you over on Patreon. Really, really appreciate all of your support. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. So tune in next time when we talk about our favorite format and our favorite game, Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and we will see you next time. Magic the Gathering is a game, and we are all here to have fun. And believe it or not, Stax players want to have fun too. Find out why. Cool. Sounds good. All right.
It's only a game. Why you have to be mad?